Welcome to Co-Opinions, where we try to get a little more insight and background to our regulars. Today we'll be interviewing me, Josh, but the person running this interview is series regular Nick Kraus.
Hi, Josh.
So why don't we go ahead and get this started, Nick?
Well, welcome to Behind the Opinion, Josh, and I gotta say I have been looking forward to probing your deepest held opinions.
I'm very proud of you right now.
What's the first game you recall playing, Josh?
So the first game I can recall playing is very similar to the ones that all people approximately our age, and that would be Super Mario Brothers for the NES. My memory can't possibly be right because I thought I got this system when I was younger than like 3. And much like everybody, I remember going immediately from the left to the right and slamming into the first Goomba, like everybody did. Now, years later, I can appreciate how that first 5 seconds of that game set up the principles of it. But at the time, I'm like, okay, so here's a monster. That ended the game. I must obviously get over the monster somehow. And that established that monsters are bad. That established you need to jump. That established how you can kill them. And then immediately after they introduced the idea of being able to jump, they introduced, well, there's other things you can jump to hit. Now, as a 2-year-old, none of this registered. I'm just like, go left, to right, jump, don't die. But it's really fascinating how well-designed that stuff was back in those days.
So you'd say it affected your enthusiasm by grounding you in good versus evil narratives that didn't give you a sense of discretion for the shades of gray which inhibit morality.
And I would actually go further than that, which is to say that without a solid narrative, I had to fill in the gaps, which allowed me to personally write whether or not I was the good guy or the bad guy in this scenario. Because at that age, pretty sure I couldn't read. So just throwing that one out there. It did do a lot to help my enthusiasm, but I don't think that I really hit my stride of gaming until as I was wrapping up grade school. We moved, and I played a fair amount of games up until that point. Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Genesis. I think I even had a PlayStation at that point. But it was when I moved from a town I'd lived in my whole life to one where not only was I in the smallest of the 3 towns that went to this high school, but I knew nobody there. There was nobody. These were informative years. I was like 8th grade. That's a terrible time to move. I think you can semi-relate to that.
I can absolutely relate. I moved at the end of 8th grade.
So that's when I really dug into the games. And a lot of stuff before that did influence me. Again, Super Mario Brothers, like most of us, the big first one. But it wasn't until I moved in middle school that I really
became a gamer.
Yeah, right.
But I guess to that point, it was something that did you find yourself, I guess, in those grade school days playing mostly multiplayer games like with other friends that you had from schools? Or were you even at that point where was it just kind of, well, I'll play some single player games as my hobby?
So it's funny you mentioned that, actually, because I remember in 2nd grade, we had to make a time capsule. And one of those things was, what do you hope to accomplish in 10 years? And it's hilarious talking to kids who have no scopes. Like, well, how old do you think your mom is? Oh, no, 25? It's like, you really don't know.
Well, it was a small town you mentioned.
Yeah, right. But anyways, I wrote down, by the time, in 10 years, I hope I've beaten 30 games. That was what my goal was.
That is precocious.
Right? But I did, I never bring this up because it's not pertinent to gaming. I do have a brother, and he's a little younger than me, so we had the opportunity to play co-op games, and sometimes I played co-op games with people from school, but for the most part, it was a single-player experience. And we actually touched on this. You weren't on this recording, and I don't think it's gone live quite yet, but we talked about our favorite couch co-op games, and we talked about how home consoles when we were younger generally didn't have the power for true cooperative play. There were taking turns, but especially because I know you have siblings as well, you don't want to take turns. You want to play.
Yep.
So there were some games like Battletoads and Smash TV that we did play, but you also had friendly fire in those, and that made...
So I know in the Behind the Opinion with Mike, he talked about a formative experience where him and his brother learned to go ahead and cover for each other when they were fighting.
Oh, we never had that.
You guys just got in trouble. There was no hidden code for you two.
So there's actually, I can say this because it's years later, well over a decade. This is one of my least proud moments, if I have to be honest. I remember when Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons came out, I didn't have enough money to buy both. So I'm like, I'll buy Seasons, brother, you buy Ages, and then we'll be able to switch when we're both done. He didn't play games as intensely as me, so I beat my game. I'm like, okay, are you done with yours? He's like, I'm through the second dungeon. I'm like, So I just kind of took it, and I'm like, here, play mine. He's like, I'm not done with mine yet. I'm like, no, just play mine. You'll be fine. He's like, Mom, I haven't finished my game yet. I'm like, no, I gave him this other one. It's cool. And I don't remember how it panned out, but I remember I think I ended up giving him the money and be like, no, it's fine. Here's the money. Because it was a few weeks later and I had it. I'm like, here's the money. It's like, no, I wanted to play the game. I'm like, no, you're fine. I wasn't the greatest brother. He wasn't the greatest brother. We've got past it.
Josh is a bully. All right.
I mean, you've listened to these recordings. Sorry, Brent. Love you, boo.
Let's transition off of this. What's your favorite genre and why, Josh?
I had to give this a little thought because I've been playing games recently that I've really got into of the puzzle genre, but for the most part, I would have to say that my favorite genre is action, and this is where it gets kind of squirrely with how a lot of things have blended into each other, because they have action RPGs, roguelites could be considered action games. I like games that keep you actively involved. When I was younger, I was a bigger fan of RPGs because they did include action, but it allowed me to be more deliberate about it. Now I find myself more drawn to games like Bayonetta, or I'm playing Nioh right now, which is Ninja Theory's take on Dark Souls. It's fascinating. I just started it up. You haven't and will never play a game by well, no, you played 3D Dot Game Heroes, but that is not Dark Souls-esque. The Nioh, it plays a lot like Dark Souls, but because of the different engine, it moves faster. It's really fascinating seeing how these different action games stack up against each other. And I don't know, I feel like the action games, more than anything, the action games and the puzzle games, I feel like there's a different kind of skill involved in both of those. That's why I really enjoy them. And not to down on people who play RPGs, because I play some and I know you truly enjoy them, but I feel like with the RPGs, you can really just go online and say, what do I need to do to beat this guy? Like, it's just an extended puzzle where the solution's laid out. If you have this build out and you do these actions, you're going to beat what was that impossible boss from that Persona? The Demi-Human? Is that what that thing was called?
I never played Persona 3, but let me flip that around. How is that any different than watching a video where you're seeing, hey, this is how someone how someone beat this action boss, and then using that to go ahead and beat the action boss yourself? Because
whether or not you can actually replicate the actions you're seeing in there's a certain modicum of skill, in my belief. So that, and I think we're going to record something about this somewhat soon, about how trophies, in my opinion, are affecting the industry. And other than like with Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy IX, where you got a little certificate saying you did a really hard thing, there's not a lot of recognition you get for beating something that's really, really difficult. And that's why I enjoy the action things, because, and this is where it can get kind of BS, and I can recognize why some people don't like it. You once mentioned a long time ago, there was a Castlevania game you played where you had to hit the boss like 100 times and he could kill you in 3 hits. That level of high stakes challenge where if you mess up, you could lose the entire boss fight of progress because you didn't have the reaction time, that really is engaging to me. And there are ways you can cheese it, like I know for Zelda 2, the really hard final boss of Shadow Link, if you crouched in the corner, you could just completely cheese him. And there are some action bosses where you can do that. I know with La Milana, the penultimate boss, they had a one-hit kill technique, but you could cheese the invincibility frames, so you hurt yourself for like 2 damage and avoided their instant kill beam that way. So there are ways you can cheese it, but I especially with the turn-based boss battles, I never felt that it was a rewarding challenge to beat them, because I felt like I just properly built my guy out and went through the blueprints. And I
feel like that's more on you following the blueprints. I mean, you can play a game like Final Fantasy VIII, customize your characters with their different draw abilities and kind of build your character as you see fit and just do that solo without using a guide. The guide isn't strictly a voluntary thing for this is a solution to this puzzle. There are many solutions.
You can do that, and this is where I've never gotten to the hardcore JRPGs. So for your Persona 3 with the demi-human or whatever that thing was called, I'm just trying to remember what is consistently called the hardest JRPG boss in history, and I think that's it. For Final Fantasy 7, 8, and I think even 9, like there was just an OP build where for 7, I remember I took down the Ruby weapon and Emerald weapon with no problem because I had like W summon and Knights of the Round with a fully maxed out blue magic enemy skill. I just steamrolled all of them.
To that point, Final Fantasy is generally considered to be one of the most casual mainstream of the JRPGs, but this is neither here nor there. Speaking of that, then, for your favorite genre about it being action games, what would you say your favorite game out of every video?
So I had to give this a lot of thought because I keep track of all the games I beat just because I'm interested in the data analytics like that. Yeah, a little bit. It doesn't destroy my life, but... So I had to think, is the game that I'm going to consider my favorite game going to be something from the last 10 years or from all time? Because if you look at all time, it's going to be undeniably tinted with nostalgia. And I had to go with all time because, I mean, that was the question. And I went with Link to the Past. And I talked about this extensively when we were doing our 2D Zelda breakdown, but I went with Link to the Past over Link's Awakening. I went with Link to the Past over Super Mario RPG. And I went with Link to the Past over some of the more modern classics like, say, Portal, or I'm trying to think of some Gears of War.
Oh, yes, a great masterpiece.
Right? Link to the Past, we've talked about this before. Those Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo games, the aesthetic of the pixel art is still pleasing. And whether or not that is because it appeals directly to our nostalgia, you see a lot of indie games nowadays that continue to use that pixel art to great effect. And I don't think it hurts their appeal to younger crowds. So if you have a 16-bit or like Shovel Knight 8-bit, younger people can still play that and enjoy that, whereas people approximately our age play and enjoy the homage to the old games. So that's why I went with the Link to the Past over Link's Awakening, because I still like the colors. Even with Suikoden, like the way the colors play with the pixel art, it just has a real nostalgic feeling for me. And it still looks good. And in addition to that, the game is still a lot of fun. And unlike the super early Zelda games, there is what one would consider to be side quests in this. So it's not just a straight path to the end, but there's also not collect 700 Korok seeds to get a piece of poop.
Is that from Breath of the Wild?
That is from Breath of the Wild. Now, you stop getting bonuses. Like, it expands in Breath of the Wild, it expands your different slots for equipment. After like 300, he stops expanding your equipment slots. The only point of getting all 700 is getting the poop, and the point of the poop is apparently lesser enemies flee holding their nose if you have it. But going back to Link to the Past...
Away from Zelda Kazuki.
Right. There were just little side things, like if you went under the bridge, there was a guy there who would give you a bottle. There were medallions that you didn't really have to collect. There were items like the blue cane. That's not the cane of Samaria, is it? I don't remember what the blue... It's the one that goes around you and makes like a force field. Or the invisibility cape. These are all optional items, and I found that to be interesting. Or the fairy fountains. I thought those were fascinating. Since I have gotten older, I've found that you can do things in different order. For example, one thing that I always found to be fascinating was between the Super Nintendo Game Boy Advance version, I believe, they changed the Ice Dungeon. Because the Ice Dungeon had a puzzle that was absolutely nightmarish, where you had to raise up the switches, go back to the beginning of the dungeon in a real circuitous route, push a block down one level, and then fall down, and it was just a huge pain in the butt. In the Game Boy Advance version, they changed it so it wasn't as nearly much a pain in the butt, but because the Ice Dungeons item they give you is only an increase in defense, I just skipped it until I always did it out of order. So I did the first dungeon, then the fourth in the Dark World. I did the first dungeon because you have to. Then the fourth one because that gives you the Titan's Mitt, which basically opens up the rest of the map. Then I do 2, then 3, then 6. And then I do 5 because you have to beat the first 6 to get the big bomb, which allows you to And I love this game.
It's worth calling out just that non-linearity for a game.
It's amazing.
A console game,
Yeah, but who plays PC games? Nobody who listens to this. Well, 2 people who listen to this, and I have you guys on fairly frequently. But that game I always felt was kind of a template for how I loved my Zelda games, which is why I enjoyed Ocarina and I enjoyed Majora's Mask, but after Ocarina made such a huge splash, both for being a giant RPG, action RPG for the N64, every 3D Zelda game between that and Skyward Sword was Ocarina, but it just felt like the same game with a little tweaking.
Ocarina, but water. Ocarina, but darker world.
Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons I enjoyed Wind Waker, was because they gave you such a big world, but it was still linear. You still had to go to these. At one point, they said, you can go to Dungeon A or B. Great, you guys gave me 2 whole options. And then with Skyward Sword, it was a 45-hour hallway. Oh my god. But
let's transition away from the PTSD and go to our next question. What is your most significant gaming memory?
So this one I had to also give a lot of thought to because, gaming is the number one thing I do. There's just no 2 ways about it. You got something to add there?
No, please continue, Josh.
Okay. So I thought about what was the most significant gaming memory. Now, it could have been things like the first time I actually bought my own console. I remember I bought a Sega Genesis with my own money. The big one I bought was the PlayStation with my own money, where I saved up enough for a memory card and Final Fantasy VII, because of course I did. And that was actually when they made the transition from PSX to PS1, the one that you could put into your cargo pockets. So I ended up being able to save a bunch of money. And those weren't the most significant to me. What really jumped out as the most significant to me was there was a Christmas where I had a Super Nintendo and I asked for the Super Game Boy and Link's Awakening. And my buddy had owned Link's Awakening and I loved it to death. But because we were in grade school, and when you're in grade school, let's be honest, you're borderline not there. You don't know things. We couldn't figure out the second dungeon for weeks because we didn't put together, you use the powder in this place to light a torch, you must use the powder in the second dungeon to light a torch. We couldn't get past the second room for weeks. But we just figured it out right before Christmas, and I got my own copy. So as soon as I got it, we do Christmas a little differently, where we get gifts from family Christmas Eve. Then on Christmas Day, we got everything from Santa. So on Christmas Eve, I got the Super Game Boy and Link's Awakening, and I immediately ran downstairs, popped them in, and within an hour and a half, I beat the first 2 dungeons in Link's Awakening. And I was in grade school, I'm like, I might be onto something here. It really jumped out at me that I had got through the game that fast. That was one of those points when I'm like, maybe these games aren't as long as I think they are. Maybe I just don't know them. So that was one of those things, one of the earlier formative memories where I really wanted to be able to amass information. So that way, just the ability for people to speedrun games, the different secrets in them that made them take longer or shorter, the different design ways they made the games be more intuitive or less intuitive. That was one of the things that helped kick that off. It wasn't the most significant memory I was anticipating. I think it did a lot for my enthusiasm.
No, that's a real one. So how come you enjoy talking about games, Josh?
So I love talking about games because there's so much going back to the whole analysis of the different ways they can be designed. We were talking about how Mario in the first 5 seconds of that game gives you all the basics of it. That's just from a game design perspective. We've also talked about how games can emotionally affect you, be it through the narrative or be how they tie into things that are going on in your current life. There are so many ways that games, and I'm not going to say do this nowadays, because you would play games on Nintendo where they tried to make it really emotionally impactful, and there were limitations of the medium now, and they did a good job on circumventing a lot of those limitations, but you can see it. Are you still planning on playing Iconoclasts?
Yes.
Okay. There is a part near the end where the game masterfully creates a situation where it seems like you can win, but you can't win, and it hits hard. You'll know what I'm talking about when you get there, but there's so many different things that go into it, and that's not just the only reason I like talking about it. One of the things that's bothered me ever since I was young, and I'm talking grade school, was when you hear video games associated with negative things. I got into this a little bit in our 50th episode. It's not the games that cause negative things. People cause negative things. So I remember when I was doing an internship at my undergrad, all my coworkers were old enough to be my parents, and they got into this bit about, oh, these games making kids so violent nowadays. And I go, can you explain that a little bit? They go, well, you never used to see kids this violent before you had these violent shooter games. I go, really? So you're saying when you were a kid, you didn't know anybody who liked to go out into the forest and hurt animals? Like, well, there was that one kid. And like, and what was he playing Doom? Was he playing Mortal Kombat? Like, well, I guess not. Though I've been playing games, at this point, I've been playing them for 15 years during my internship. Do I seem like a guy who's unhinged? Do I seem like I have a problem to you? No, you seem to have it together. Exactly. I'm going to finish up my 4-year degree. I'm not going to have any debt to my name. I'm going to get a decent job, and I have a plan for the future. Meanwhile, I will be playing games. Does this seem to affect me in any way, shape, or form? Well, I guess not. Exactly. You can be a contributing member, things can still work, and you can play games. You don't need to blame TV, you don't need to blame movies, you don't need to blame video games. You see, they still look for a scapegoat, and we're seeing this now, and I love it, where all the people who want to blame all these media, they're getting old. They're starting to phase out. And some of these beliefs are trickling down to a slightly younger generation, but you have a lot of people who've grown up doing this. Like, when we have kids, which will happen in the next 5 years-ish, I would guess, we're not going to demonize these things because we grew up with them. That generational switch-off is starting to happen, and I want to be part of the conversation about why these things do matter. And that's where I get disappointed, like, when somewhat recently they tried to call out all the violence in video games, and then the Video Game Association or whoever shot back with, well, yeah, but look at all these sweet things. You're not talking about the context. Like, you want to talk about the game that both gives you a real... For example, Get Out. There was a game called Get Out that... No, not Get Out. A Way Out. That was it. Get Out was that movie. A Way Out, where it was basically an homage to old action movies, and it was necessary to be co-op. Now, this game had a lot of violence in it, but it also had, over the course of the game, you saw the humanizing sides of both of your characters, and it comes to a head at the end where one of you, and you've been playing this whole game co-op, at the end, one of those characters has to die. And it's an incredibly powerful moment because you've been seeing these characters' lives and their violence and their struggle. Like, these are people who have been created. So it's not just the part where you're sad that somebody won't be going home to their family. It's the fact you've been through a lot with them in the process. And these are the conversations that need to happen. And I wasn't trying to be overly dramatic in the 50th episode. I would like to have more people in on these conversations. I would like to have more adult conversations where it's not, oh, well, you need to talk about how there's dicks in this game, and there's a time and place for talking about dicks in video games. I'm not
your friends. Great co-op classic.
God. There's a time and place for talking about it, but it's what bothers me about the YouTube culture where it's people screaming and crying and being over...
Reaction video to a reaction video to a reaction video.
Right. It's not adding anything to the conversation. And we've both read the book, Trust Me, I'm Lying, where it talks about the most powerful emotion people can feel is anger, which is a true bummer because I'm not going to try to evoke the emotion of anger. I want to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly here. So, anyways.
And that's why you enjoy talking about video games.
That is why I enjoy talking about video games.
What did you say your hope for the future of gaming is, Josh, to wrap things up?
My hope for the future of gaming is more or less encapsulated in some of the things I've been previously talking about. I am hoping that we see a semi-smooth transition from games being taboo, because it is my belief in the early 90s, especially when, what was his name? Mick something, the ambulance chaser who was trying to get all... Jack Thompson. When he was trying to make them all taboo and video games were the new causing people to kill their babies.
New comic books.
Right. I'm wanting to see a peaceful transition of power there. I want to see people who are like, yeah, games are just as legitimate of a form of expression as paintings, as TV shows, as music. I want to see it where these are just recognized how we can express ourselves. And that's why I think this indie movement has been so beneficial. Now, we've seen a lot of people have to bail out because it's not sustainable. I've talked about why I believe indie games are typically 8 or 16-bit isn't just for nostalgia purposes, but because it's a much easier production style. But I think we're starting to see that transition, and it's encouraging to me.
I personally think that we're pretty much there, just from my experience. I mean, I'm married now, but like I remember with online dating, seeing women who talked about how they didn't like people who played video games, and went on a date with a couple of them, and literally everyone that I talked to, their focus wasn't on the video games as a whole. For them, video games was kind of a stand-in for people that were neglecting their responsibilities. I have no job. I have no plan for the future. I live with my parents, and I just sit around.
And that I've seen that applied to a few things. I don't like people who play video games. Well, why don't you like people who play video games? For the reasons you said. It's kind of like, why don't like people who smoke pot? Well, why don't you like people who smoke pot? Well, they don't do anything. What if I told you I knew people who were actually like making $50,000 a year, living on their own, and they like to smoke pot? Well, that's not what I'm talking about. Right. You're talking about people who don't do anything. You don't like lazy people.
Yeah, I mean, you did make a fair point there about that recent dust-up about the violent video games, but I really, to your point, like you said, where these beliefs are starting to kind of phase out, I think this is like the last gasp page.
And that's why every time I see a headline, this is dated at this point, but like your Gamergate thing, I'm like, yeah, I can't even buy into this, because what we have is a vocal minority here. Like when the Mass Effect 3 thing happened and it actually was making news about how enough people complained. It's a symptom of the sensationalization of a lot of news stuff. So you have 3 million people who played a game. 200,000 of them got really upset about a thing. News needed something along the lines of angry gamers threaten company into changing game. Well, that's not really what happened.
Gotta feed the beast, need those clicks.
So, and like you said, I do believe that we're starting to see it on the way out, and it is my belief that by the time we hit retirement age, God, can you imagine what the landscape's gonna look like by the time we hit retirement age? We're halfway there. Like, I can't imagine, what is Nintendo or Sony or Microsoft going to be putting out in 30 years? 30 years ago, Nintendo had put out NES, and now they have the portable Switch console. Like, I
don't think I can predict events for a 2 or 3 year horizon. I don't want to try for 30 years.
I don't know what's coming up at E3, man. That's like not long to not date it.
Let's put a pin on this then. Josh's hope for the future of gaming is cool stuff at E3.
Yes, that's exactly what I was hoping to accomplish there. But I have high hopes for this just because we've already seen it going in a positive direction. I enjoy talking about games because I think it's creating a more constructive conversation around all of it. And even if I don't hit all of the numbers I want to hit by the time we get to episode number 100, I do believe that this has been a strong time capsule of things that we believed at this point, and I hope that it gives an indicator of where things go.
A capture of the zeitgeist of the millennials as they enter into the late 2010s.
I'm so glad we're rapidly moving away from, we're starting to acknowledge on a societal level that millennials are now in the workforce. Like,
they are now managers at companies.
Right. Like, you can't keep that. That doesn't keep my not quite father-in-law from complaining about him. Like, dude.
At any rate, it seems we've hit a final digression point. Josh, thank you for letting me interview and quiz you here for Behind the Opinion.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for having me on. But until next time, this is Behind the Opinion with Josh.